Here we go. Welcome to the International Schools Podcast. John Mickton, your co-host, and Dan is out today, but will be with us on the next episode. I'm really excited to have two longtime friends and who I have immense respect for the incredible work they do in the education space. One is Jeff, and the other is Tricia. And before I continue, I'm just going to really turn over to them and let them introduce themselves, and then we'll dig in and kind of looking at the professional development landscape, but more importantly, their own journeys as educators. Both were in international schools, have transitioned to being consultants, and have created some amazing professional development environments, Learning to Edora, and now shiftingschools.com. So it's just going to be really exciting to hear their journey. And then maybe what are some of the things ahead? You know, what should we be aware of, red flags or whatever, things to be excited about as educators and school leaders. So Tricia, why don't you kick off? Just kind of give a little bio background, and then we'll go over to Jeff.
Sure. Hi, my name is Tricia Friedman. My pronouns are she and her. As John mentioned, I've been an international school educator for nearly 2 decades. Before my wife, who's Canadian, I'm American, we decided let's plant some roots. Let's try being a little bit closer to family. So we're located now just off of Vancouver Island, and it's been an absolute joy and privilege to get to work closely with Jeff, who I've known for a long time. But it's really been a great ride, kind of joining his team and working with him currently as his creative content director, and pivoting from working with a school to working with multiple schools at once. And I also have consultancy work that I do through allyed.org, where I work with schools who are interested in becoming more LGBTQ plus inclusive. So thanks for having us on today, John.
So good to have you. Jeff.
Hi. Well, thanks for having us. I appreciate it. My name is Jeff Utecht. My pronouns are he and him. I am getting better at this thanks to all the work with Tricia over the last couple of years. So it's been great. I spent 10 years internationally as well. I beat Tricia back to the States by a couple of years. Now make my home in Seattle, Washington. In Shanghai, China, and then 4 years in Bangkok before my wife and I decided to move back to be a little bit closer to our parents. You know, as health starts to affect our parents, a lot of times international educators will move home for a while. It was never going to be what we were going to do. Like when we were international educators, we're like, oh, we're doing this forever. We're never moving back. And then of course, here we are back in Seattle. But we're both originally from the state of Washington, and so it's been great to get back here and plant some roots as well. And still love to do a lot of international travel. I was working with the International School of Luxembourg. Actually, we should talk about this, John. Like the week that the pandemic started, I'm there in Luxembourg, and yes, John and I are looking at each other, going like, "Oh boy, here we go!" Right? Like that's
right. And you flew out just by the skin of your teeth. You remember, because they were closing down borders.
Yeah.
And Jeff with his Nespresso bag really
just made it out in time. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was crazy. It was crazy.
Crazy times. One of the things that has been interesting is doing this podcast and talking to a lot of people. There are more and more educators like yourselves that have been in the classroom, have done some amazing work in their schools and really inspired teachers, and then have this calling to go beyond and say, you know what, I want to reach a larger audience. I want to do something at a larger scale, or with it more kind of maybe in many different schools. And of course, Jeff, you were very much involved with Learning to, and then Edora Learning, and of course the Coattail. And one of the things I'd love to hear from both of you, when you decided to do this, there's a bit of a risk. You're going into the unknown. And unless you have a lot of Apple stock or Google stock, I assumed you had to consider some of the financial risks and implications. And I think what would be interesting to hear, to kind of start this journey is, what was some of the thinking and what were some of the risks you took, and how did you maybe mitigate them? Or you just said, I'm going to do it? And just love to hear from both of you on that kind of, when you jumped, so to speak, into that consultancy role. You don't all have to speak. Okay, Tricia,
yeah,
I'll
do
that.
All right. I think I was a little bit, maybe ahead of kind of Tricia making that jump. For me, it really became when did the doing consultancy work outpace working in a school? And for me, that's really what I was kind of going back and forth on. And there was a couple different things and I think number one is just being open to opportunity, which I find a lot of times it's easy to say, it's hard to do. To just be able to allow opportunities in and figure out where it is you want to go. You talk about learning too. I mean, there's all these little pieces that add up to where we go. I mean, for me, I started my blog, The Thinking Stick, in 2005. I was just dinking around. I was at Shanghai American School. I was a tech teacher at the time when we still had pull-out tech classes. And in between classes, I set up a WordPress blog, and because I saw a couple other educators blogging. And I will honestly say, I think I got a little bit lucky. I was, one of the first international bloggers. John, you were right there with me. I think we were a couple of the first and only international teachers blogging. And so that gave us a different voice. It gave us a niche. And so as blogging took off, my voice became more and more amplified. And then these little things kind of, there was another tech director, John Zerflu, who is now the head of school at International School of Warsaw. He was a tech director in Shanghai at the time too, and was like, hey, what if the 3 big international schools got together and did a conference? And so he invited the other tech people in from the other schools, and that's how Learning 2 started. That is still going strong today. So that's why it's called, a conference started by teachers for teachers. A big part of that, it was just us. We all just got together and we literally funded it out of our pockets. Like we said, let's do this. What would it look like? And then we got Irikos on board, and Dick Kreitzer through the years really supported us. And so that kind of took off, which gave me a stage. Like I made my own stage to give Learn 2 talks, and and people get to know you a little bit more. And so that happened. And next thing I know, I think most of it from the blog. I started a podcast. The Shift in Our Schools podcast starts at the time with a friend, David Carpenter. It starts in 2007. And he was in Hong Kong at the time. And I think part of the cool part is you have to remember is we're learning through the technology. Like in 2007, we're recording. We don't have anything like StreamYard or Zoom with high quality. I mean, we had a soundboard. I had a soundboard in my house, and we're trying to have cords coming in and out of Skype because it's the only way you could do it. None of this stuff existed. And it's just mind blowing to think that when you kind of look back, you had to go through and you grow, through the technology. I think for me, the big thing though is I'd started getting asked to do a couple conferences. I did Irikos for quite a few years. I got asked to come in and do NISA, or I would actually started, just submitting and doing conferences for free. And I think anybody that's looking to jump the consultancy work, the thing you need to do is get your name out there. And the best way to do that's at conferences. And you're not going to get paid. You're going to be paying your own flights and your own hotel rooms. And, you're not getting the best slots. You're getting the last slot on the last day of the conference. And that's where you start. And you start to fill rooms because your message is good and people notice. And so that kind of is where I was by the end of Shanghai. And I think the big thing for me was, I was starting to make that shift of like, okay, I kind of want to do this. I like working with other educators. I like motivating people to do things different. And it's at the same time. So this is 2008, end of the school year. And the whole thing came out like Web 2.0 is just kind of taking off, really starting to find its footing. But this idea comes out around 20% time, that Google gives their engineers 20% time to work on side projects. And I was like, what would be cool is if I could find a school that would allow me 20% time, understanding that everything that I'm working on in this tech world at the time, everything that we're thinking about, like you need somebody to go out there. I call them scouts now when I'm working with school. Like you need scouts that go out and are going to conferences and talking to people and are bringing that back to your school. I was like, and I was just like, wouldn't it be cool if I could find a school that would want to do that? And so I blogged it. My blog was very popular at the time. I had, over 10,000. And so I put it on my blog. I'm looking for something different is the name of the blog post. And I just said, look, I'm looking for a different school that would be willing to do this. And the leaders at International School of Bangkok said, we'll do that with you. And so I had a full-time contract with the option to take up to 20%, which is 40 days a year. I'd pay free to go and do other things. And so that's where I wrote my book during that time, which was huge. I started doing more conferences at that time, which was huge. And out of that, by the time we get there, Cotel came out of that, which was huge for us. And again, it was like schools coming to us and saying, hey, look, we would love to have this master's degree program. What do you think? And at the time, Kim Cafino and I are in Bangkok, and we're like, we can do that. And we just make it. And so it's just like taking these opportunities. And so by the time 2012 came around, it was two things. One, my wife saying, I need you home during weekends, because at this point I'm gone all the time. I'm at that point almost working 2 full-time jobs. And so at some point you have to make this decision of like, okay, I'm going to give this a go. Financially taking a huge risk, as you said, and so made the jump, crossed my fingers, and so far everything's worked out okay. So.
Fantastic. And I think it's that really believing in your idea and yourself and being able to do the jump and knowing that, you just have to be confident in it. And obviously you had that track record where you were building an audience and where you're working 2 jobs and you realize, okay, now I can give up one.
Yeah, right. Yeah. That was my dream.
Tricia, tell us a bit about your story.
Sure. And I kind of one thing that Jeff didn't mention that I feel like maybe he's not giving himself enough credit for is it's the relationships piece. I mean, something that I've observed, and I consider myself like consultant light and Jeff consultant pro. When you watch Jeff work and you watch Jeff build connections with schools, it's got this great foundation of relationships. I mean, anytime we had a session and somebody wanted some help afterwards, Jeff always is right there, enthusiastic to, continue to work with people 20, 30 minutes after the session was supposed to be over. And I just think, that piece of authentically caring about teachers is huge. And not every consultant really has that, where they get it, that being a classroom teacher is an extremely difficult job. And to respect that and to have teachers feel that, I think just makes a massive, massive difference, and maybe is the most important thing. And Jeff, I've just really appreciated seeing you model that if that's not there, everything else is kind of just superficial. But I would also say Learning To is a really great little playground for me to get started with, for folks who haven't connected with them yet. One of the things that, John and Jeff, maybe you feel this as well, it really is a community when you are running a workshop or you're giving a talk. You're not just drafting something in isolation and then delivering it. You're workshopping it with fellow educators who are there to really give you feedback, and really to push and stretch you. And that's something that, I've always really appreciated about Learning To. It's so unique as a conference. Most other conferences I've been a part of, it's like, that's your room, or this is the time that you'll be on stage, and that's it. Whereas Learning To is, you are partnered with people who genuinely want to nurture and support you, which is really fantastic. And that EdTech piece that, Jeff brought up, I think today, when we're talking about the importance of digital literacy for teachers, we're talking about if you would like to pivot and do something different, these things are not only great for your learners, they're great for your learning. And I do think that piece about understanding how to get a message out, that is so, sometimes I kind of, as a former lit teacher, we hammer the idea that you have to be able to write an essay. It's 2021. If you want to be an advocate, how do you actually get your message out there? And the tools, blogging, podcasting, social media, you have to be able to cut through the noise. You have to be able to understand your audience. That empathy piece, I think, is really huge. And one thing that I think Shifting Schools does really well is we really have conversations about what is it that teachers need right now? What can we do to support them? And Jeff and I talk all the time about sometimes you literally just need a resource that is ready to roll out in the next hour. So how can we create some templates and some resources where I'm going to be able to use this not a month from now or a year from now. I could use it today. And again, I think it's, if you're going into consultancy work for education, understand that teachers have been, historically always overworked. They're making so many decisions. Teachers have so many different layers of, quote unquote bosses. So what can you do to, make it a little bit easier for them to do the super important, super complex work that they do?
And I think that's what I really like about the resources that are in the show notes is these PDFs. It's very much with empathy, understanding. It's Monday or it's the beginning of the year. I'm exhausted. I just finally saw my family. Thank you. There's the PDF, and I think that is really powerful. And I love the way you brought up this empathy piece, because I always appreciate with Jeff is that when he's in a school, he'll go and have lunch with the middle school kids. He's like, I don't want to talk to faculty, but of course he will talk to faculty. But that idea that having those conversations, and doesn't matter who comes up, let me talk to you. And I think, both of you in your work, the empathy piece is so front and center, and you feel it even when you start your podcast and just the work. And I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I think that's what people want to know. There's the empathy, and then let's talk about other things, and making that front of center, I think really is an important point. Now, both of you you do these resources, you're working with schools. Tricia, you're doing a lot of work with LGBT. Talk a bit about how are you navigating, because there are a lot of other people in that education space. Have you decided there's this niche? Is there a certain way of doing it that's unique to you? How do you grapple with that? Because of course you want to, this is your income. You need to get an audience. And how are you finding what your purpose is? And have you found that you had to be kind of flexible and adaptable, or you really have this very clear vision?
I think for that piece, the time that I spent at United World College of Southeast Asia was incredibly valuable, because there were so many educators who were really vulnerable in saying, I want to do more, I don't know how. And I think that reminded me of how, and this is related to ed tech or any kind of, shift in pedagogy. Teachers often want to do the quote unquote right thing, but they also don't want to get it wrong or, feel like maybe they are setting themselves or their students up for something that's not going to be successful. And I think when you're talking about LGBTQ plus inclusion, there's an additional level of sensitivity where I think folks are really concerned with saying the wrong thing. And so, I often try to support teachers in saying, it's allyship is a journey, right? We're all learning. Language is always shifting. And it's the same with educational technology, right? When I think back to 10 years of how we would refer to different tools or practices, that language has shifted. So I think, just understanding that, again, maybe it's the empathy piece, that learning is a journey. Again, teachers are doing so much. So how can we remind them that, it's a process and it's about making steady progress, and that it's also about reckoning with that tension between, there's the student layer, there's the parent caretaker layer, there's the administration and board layer, there's the school context and culture. There's a lot around that to navigate. And so I think it's looking at what's your day-to-day kind of practice. Right now, Jeff and I have our pronouns up on the screen. What are the little signposts that you can leave for inclusion? And then what are the ways that you can actually rethink your curriculum? So I guess the short answer is really thinking about what's daily practice and what's the vision piece, and how do you balance doing both of those things, understanding that, again, teachers are doing 10 times more than maybe they should have to be doing. And there's still a global pandemic on. So I think understanding the nature of the job and how change happens, that it's not about a school goes from point A to point Z in a week, but how can you set folks up so that they're ready to sustain that effort and have lots of different things they can experiment with. And again, I think that's similar to ed tech. I don't know, you both have probably seen this too, where a school says, we want to implement more digital literacy, and it's not everybody's proficient by Friday.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that I like is about, the day-to-day, the granularity of the day-to-day needs, and then having that vision piece. And Jeff, that's something that I think you always do. When you present, you have that kind of very helicopter view, that provocation. But in balance, you're also saying, well, you're in the classroom, and the reality is with these third graders, this is how it's going to be. Talk a bit about that tension that you think, that you address with teachers.
Yeah, and I think, building off of what Tricia said, I mean, Tricia's really helped me specifically around the LGBTQ plus, as because inclusion's in everything we do. I mean, it doesn't matter what your consultancy on, like inclusion's a part of it now. And I keep coming back to this idea that doing something is better than doing nothing. And to Tricia's point, when it comes to inclusion, and we're talking about, inclusion specifically around LGBTQ or equity issues in their classroom, it can get really freaked out that you're going to do the wrong thing. And to the point that it's a journey, and doing something is better than doing nothing. And no matter what it is you're working on, I think as teachers, we get caught a lot, like Tricia was saying, in this mindset of I want to make sure it's perfect. We have I find that there's a mindset in teachers of I want to do it, and I want to do it perfectly. Yeah. Well, that doesn't happen, especially when you have 28 kids running around in your classroom. There's no such thing as perfect. One of the things I like to remind teachers is they call this the teaching practice. Every day is just practicing. There's no such thing as mastery in this job. The day you think you've mastered teaching is the day you need to retire, because there's no mastery. We're all just practicing constantly. And we have to be willing to take risks, of putting your pronouns on the screen for the first time, or writing them on the whiteboard for the first time. And it's risky, but that's what it is. It's doing something. What am I doing? I need to start somewhere. And so you do something.
And I think that's so important. What you both are saying is people are very cautious, and how can we support them to understand that caution is good? That's good. But also feel comfortable, the idea of practice, maybe messing up. And I think the LGBT with the diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the Black Lives Matter, Me Too, I think for a lot of people, that landscape became uncomfortable because there was so much, and they weren't sure how to position themselves because they were self-reflective, and I want to do it right. I wanted, and is there a right? We don't know, and we're all learning about this. So I really like the way you're saying is just go ahead and do it, and believe in yourself. And it's practice. If you mess up, be honest. I'm sorry, I said the wrong thing because I'm still learning, and help me say it the right way. I think that's, some of the things that I think are so important that you're highlighting. In both of your work, I like that you're saying now it's just part of it. It's just weaved everywhere. It's not siloed. Okay, now it's inclusion time, or now it's LGBT time. How are people reacting to that? Because you were saying that you're doing work and with this, and you weave this almost as if it's not something that you highlight. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's what we try to do. And, I think we try to just, I just try to be respectful, as Tricia said, of just where everybody is. The idea of, especially coming from my tech lens, is right now, social emotional learning is a big part of that. And so it's, how does technology support you in social emotional learning? Or how can you try something new in a tech world that also is supporting your students socially and emotionally? Or is also, here's something you can do with technology, and it also is inclusive. And so it's trying to help teachers understand, and just trying to wrap our minds around that. It's not, to your point, there's not silos of this is technology time, this is now inclusion time, this is equity time, but that there are ways to build units, lessons, whatever you want to call them, right? Standards-based approaches. There's ways to create these things where it's truly integrated, and you're looking at tools and methods that kids shouldn't even know they're learning social emotional learning, right? I mean, it should just be weaved into this idea of here's a place for us to stop, to reflect, to think on how we're doing, and that's just good teaching. Here's a spot. One of our favorite free PDFs is this one called calibration. What is it?
Collaboration, recalibration. It's a tongue twister too.
Recalibration, yeah. Collaboration, recalibration. It's one of my favorite PDFs to share with teachers, because it's these quick little stories that you can do with your students so you find yourself in a group where you don't like the other kids. What do? And we just take a pause before we do group work. We take a pause to just help support kids. Like, you end up in a group you don't like, which happens to us all the time. Doesn't matter how old you are. It's just like, and so having these just pausing before you jump into the group work, to have just a quick conversation of, how do you navigate this? What does this look like? Giving kids those tools so that if you do find yourself in that situation, you can lean back on that knowledge and say, like, oh, here's a strategy I have to support myself or to support my team.
And that pause is also valid for adults, because so often adults come into groups and they come with their perceptions and their agendas or their assumptions. And I think that pausing gives them an opportunity maybe to metacognition and say, oh, I'm coming in with a presumption. So I think that's really important. Tricia, when you work with teachers on this, what have been some of the learnings you've seen as this is, coming part of the landscape? What are some things that maybe you're like, ooh, didn't realize that was going on?
I think it's interesting, Jeff, that you bring up that guide, because at the core of that guide is our need to rehearse, right? Is us to think about, there's a scenario. What if before that thing happened, before I'm put into a group with someone I don't like, what if I'm given the opportunity to actually rehearse that conversation of how I might advocate for myself, of how I might approach that person? And I think that's the thing that I keep coming back to, is teachers need that rehearsal time. And Bell Hooks writes about the reality that, half your curriculum walks into the room when the students do. We have the so-called curriculum that we have to teach, but we are, not teaching it into a vacuum. And I think what Jeff was talking about is really the shift of the power dynamic that we experienced as students, where, I was there to hopefully just absorb whatever a teacher was saying. And now, no, a school is a community where we learn from one another, and reckoning with the reality that in order to do that, we might want to get to know each other, understand one another, and making more space for that. And, realizing that engagement is about student choice and student voice. And I can still see that's a real tension for people, because our experience as students was the teacher didn't care about me having a choice or a voice. It really was like, hey, open the book to this chapter, do that. Don't bother me. And it's been a massive, massive shift. And I think, it's both a wonderful and a really complicated time to be a teacher, because you have more tools at your disposal than you need. And you are also, expected to, I think, reckon with, the damage that school has done. The other big thing is realizing, when we look at our curriculums now, wow, they're, curriculums were pretty racist, were pretty sexist, were pretty homophobic. Just even the idea of, what did school tell you in terms of who a genius is? Yeah. When I went to school, that person, that genius, kind of looked like one type of person. And yeah. I think we realize we want students, we want school to be a thing that heals society. And I think, education is really dealing with that truth that, there's been some damage done and we need to undo it. And I think that's where the power of rehearsal comes in, because if you're trying to do something drastically different from what you experienced as a learner, we really do need to practice it. And I find when we have that time to work with one another, even just practicing conversations, that's really powerful. And again, I think schools that build those learning communities where teachers feel like I can practice with my colleagues, those are the ones that, they do really well. If your school is a system where teachers feel really afraid of failure or really afraid of trying something new, there's not going to be a lot of growth. And I keep drawing this parallel between ed tech and inclusion. But, again, schools where it was sort of oh, there's this great tool, or, there's this new literacy that we would like to embed. Schools where teachers are like, let me play around with this. Let me try it out. Let me show you. Can you show me what you were doing? And it's the same with inclusion, right? How would you disrupt homophobic bullying? Can we talk about that? Can we practice that versus, let's all be silent around how we do the work that we do and never share it because what if I'm doing it wrong? I don't want anybody to know. And that's school leaders that make sure they model, hey, I'm learning too. I'm trying this, and who are willing to sort of say, oh, I made this mistake, or I don't know how to do this. Can someone help me? That's huge.
And the time piece is so important because you're saying we need to rehearse, we need to find, and we know what time is like in schools. It's just like, and also for leaders to give themselves time, because so often leaders say, we want you to do this, but I don't have time to do it, or I don't have time to try it to make sure I'm also practicing. So I think that's so powerful. And I think that's the creative tension, is how as school leaders and educators, we make that a priority, that rehearsal time that you talk about, because, it feels like we're taking time from something else, but I think in the long run, taking it away and focusing on that, there's a return, such a high return on what you get back. And I think we're still struggling with that. And in Europe,
like one of our resources over at Shifting Schools, and you'll get a link in the show notes to all of our free PDFs. I think we're right close to 50, if I remember, Tricia.
That's right.
Tricia's been pounding them out. But, one of them, one of the things that is overarching to all of this is we have this download called Empowering PLCs, where it's a structure that a PLC can take. Just having these micro rehearsals, or how do I start opening up a conversation? Because there are so many ways that we can do this now. I mean, podcasts. Are we listening to podcasts in our PLCs? You need to stop and take a, and we're all going to listen to this 30-second clip or this 4-minute clip of a podcast, and then go through a process of just like, what did you hear? What does that make us think of? What do we think about the idea as a team inside of our PLCs? So I think part of it is, time has always been an issue. I think a big part of it is we need to start to restructure our time. And PLCs to me is one of those places where you get to sit here with your colleagues, whatever group that you. And can we restructure that in a place that allows us one, between the amount of blog posts in education, the amount of podcasts in education that are out there today, just take one time. Let's talk about it. Let's reflect on it. Let's see where it is. And we slowly go into starting to bring these practices in.
And I think, Jeff, what Jeff is talking about there, again, is the shift in power dynamics, that in terms of how a school does PD, that can be more of a collective conversation as well. It doesn't always necessarily need to be somebody from the leadership, kind of saying, this is the goal, this is the objective, and here's how we're going to get to it. Rather, okay, how can actually some of our tech tools free up time? And how can we also, just be honest and realize that sometimes that sit and get PD is not engaging, is, feels like an energy and time drain on teachers. So what can we do that's creative, that's a little bit different? And the podcast PD model that, again, folks can get to it from shiftingschools.com. That's about what Jeff was saying. Like, podcasts are a great tool. And also, guess what? Sometimes teachers, just like students, they need that processing time. So what if we took a podcast, take it on a run, take it on a walk, listen to it while you're doing your grocery shopping, right? Like, teachers also have lives outside of school. And here's some protocols, here's some tools for reflection, for scaffolding a discussion. Think about it. That power of, delaying our time between consuming something and really truly processing it, letting the ideas percolate. Then let's come together. And I think that piece, it's about trust too, right? Like, if you're a school where there's high trust, you don't need to watch teachers consume something. You realize, hey, I trust them.
Yeah.
We're in this together. So we can do this differently. We don't all necessarily need to be in one space looking at the same thing at the same time. And I think actually when we talk about blended learning and we talk about that shift in power dynamics in the classroom, I think actually schools that mirror that in their professional development, teachers understand, oh, I'm being trusted, I'm being valued, and, I'm being treated like a professional learner. Like that's what we want in schools, where people feel like they are being treated with that care and respect that ultimately I think that sets us up for better learning. If I'm being treated like, someone who cannot be trusted to do the work, or I'm being treated like someone who might not be interested in it, I'm disengaging. Like that's immediately going to make me not want to engage. And again, I think we've mentioned empathy multiple times, and it gets to that yet again.
Jeff?
Yeah, Tricia, you have to remind me, but we had a school leader on our podcast, and I just love this. They said, coming out of the pandemic, one of the changes they're seeing is this change from professional development to professional learning. And I can't remember who said it. It was an international school leader.
It's Kathleen Nagley, who's head of school of ISH.
ISH, right. And I just love that. And I think she's right. What we're seeing coming out of this pandemic is a switch from this idea of professional development, where development is kind of done to you through your district or school, to now live in 2021. It's professional learning. You can go and learn this stuff. One of the things that I still just cringes me is when I'll have a teacher in one of the sessions come up and say, oh, I would love to be more inclusive in my classroom, but my school district or my school hasn't given me training on that yet. Well, you live in 2021. If you want to be a more inclusive teacher, there's all kinds of resources out there.
Yeah.
It's not about professional development. It's about professional learning. Can you go out and find this stuff? And I think as we're, one of the things we wanted to cover in this episode was this idea of like the future of professional development or professional learning. And I really do think podcasts like this podcast, like our podcast, I think that is the future. I think this idea that you personalize it, like I only want to, right now I'm focused on inclusion. I'm going to go find the Ally Ed podcast from Tricia and just like, I'm going to binge this thing like we do shows on Netflix. I want to know everything, or I'm really interested in leadership, or I'm really interested, and you can go find this stuff and you yourself. And what it allows us to do is this amazing thing we've been missing in professional development for a long time is the personalization. It's really hard to personalize a workshop when you have 100 people in there.
Yeah.
But when you realize you have all these resources, how do we take control of it? You know what? I'm leading a PLC school. The PLC is we really want to dig into what? Go find a blog, go find a podcast and bring that into your PLC and drive that. Like it's free, it's sitting there waiting for us. You don't wait for your school to, tell you like, oh, this year we're going to talk about equity, or this year it's going to be about inclusion, or this year it's about tech integration and blended learning. You don't have to wait anymore. It's 2021.
And I think too, with that, the other piece that we incorporate in our trainings and our different offerings is educators get kind of a ready-made journal. It's a digital portfolio, and it can be customized. Like we've given them some templates and some things, but we always reiterate, you are the expert in your context. So stuff that's not relevant to you, delete, ignore, change it up. But we want to give you some examples. And I think that piece about setting educators up to share their story of learning is huge, because I think it's also about recognizing educator voice. You can have all the initiatives in the world as a school, but unless you are giving teachers that time to come together to share, to have dialogues around different experiences, you're not going to have any change. So, I think that's the other critical piece, is understanding that educators are leading with the leadership team, and that, there are certain things you can put in place that's going to make that a little bit easier. And I think using technology so that educators can document, so they can, again, have a space where ideas can, here's what I'm thinking right now. I might not be thinking the same thing a week from now, but I have an actual tool for reflection that is really like a trampoline into future conversations. Because I think, that's the other thing that, I think consultants who have been in PD where they have felt, I know this can be better, that's a conversation that many of us have had as well. It's that, do people in the room feel like they're being respected and that they are going to drive conversation, or they're just there as an audience to the initiative? And I think at Shifting Schools, we get that. You are not, the audience to an idea. You are the change maker, actually. Like, you are, a person that has the capacity to make the shift yourself. So here are the tools that are going to help with that, not just, passively absorb, because, again, that's not respecting who educators are. I think most educators are highly creative people. I think that's why many people are attracted to the field in the first place. So what can we do to make more space for that creativity?
And I think it's this idea of curation, where as a consultant, you curate these provocations, these moments, these opportunities, and you as a participant intrinsically decide, oh, I'm going to go for that or go for that. And I love the term that you say about the professional learning community. And I'm wondering, in your work and what we're seeing here in the world, especially through the pandemic, where many teachers were maybe more online than they anticipated, and maybe through that experience start reaching out more. And I definitely felt that, like, there were a lot of social media groups that were far more active. People were like, help, I'm hybrid. Do you think that's that this old traditional model, the sage on the stage, there are a lot of amazing consultants, but usually it's like a PDF or a PowerPoint, and we sit there, and then there's a Q&A. And this is no disrespect to all the wonderful consultants out there, many who are my friends. But I think what you're saying is like, hold on, we need to empower and show that empathy. And are you seeing that in schools starting to do that?
I think we're starting to see it. I think that, I think it's one thing we learned out of the pandemic. It was a real shock to our system of, there's other ways we can do this, and we were talking about this before we started recording. And I think all three of us have seen this, where just not traveling as much, when it costs the school a flight and hotels and a rental car versus a Zoom and everybody knows Zoom. And for better or for worse, everybody knows Zoom. And the crazy thing is, we could have done that before, but there was no reason to, and it wasn't the way things were done, right? And we get stuck in this all the time, but it wasn't the way things were done. And even in the business world, they're having more Zoom meetings now. And so I think it is a balance. I think it's a balance of all, and I think we still want to be face-to-face. Absolutely 100%. There's something about going to a conference, and, we've talked about this from the very beginning. And this was one of the founding parts of learning too, is that the real learning at a conference, it happens in the hallway between sessions. Yeah. And so how do you make your conference as social as possible? And that's always been a tenet of learning too, since it started back in 2007. And I think we're finding that as well, is like, there's a time when, a good talk, we all like to be inspired by a good talk. That's why, TED Talks are one of the top YouTube channels. Like, we love it. It's somebody who can give us a good motivational talk or lay down an idea, whether you agree with it or not, get you fired up. And so there's still a place for that. But there's also going to be a place for Zoom meetings where I don't have to travel across the city if you're in a larger district, or you're on like, I'm thinking of Shanghai American School that's on 2 campuses. And when I lived there, it was a 3-hour bus ride between the two, right? Like, we don't have to do that anymore. Like, we could have been meeting as teams in a different way because it's there. And I think we're starting to expand that into this idea of, there's social groups just around my grade level. The Twitter hashtags I've seen really start to really start rolling here. And the same thing with podcasts, that there are communities around our podcast. And I think that's part of what we try to do at Shifting Schools. Tricia and I work together. She lays down the script because she's an English teacher and I'm dyslexic. So it works really well. And then, I go in and we fiddle with it and we kind of figure out what it is. But our idea is like, we're going to lay something down. Like here's an idea. Here's something. Here's a free PDF that goes with it. And feel free to rip it apart, or feel free to take a part of it. You know, we're going to give you an idea. What you do with that is up to you. And it's just trying to there's different ways we can be empowered, and we can be different way we can engage with people that you don't even see, which I think is really cool. You know, two of our favorite things that I love about Shifting Schools is almost every single one of the free PDFs over there, and we're up to almost 50 now. Almost every single one of them has come from an email from somebody saying, hey, I could really use a resource on blank. And we'll make it for you. Like that's what Tricia and I love to do. We love to support educators. So you need something, email us, and we're just like, yes. And then we take those free PDFs and we take them into the podcast, and we're like, all right, let's break this down. Here's how I would do this, or here's what we're thinking about this, you know. And so you get this little bit of background about how you might want to use that PDF as well. So just trying, you know, again, starting with empathy and trying to figure out what can we do best to support everyone in this time. So.
Tricia?
I think, you know, that idea, are we seeing this in schools? We have heard back from a few folks who have said, okay, this idea of the podcast as a tool for meetings. Yeah, we've tried that out. And I think I know I mentioned this already, but the schools that get comfortable and can be vulnerable enough to experiment and try things out. Because I think if the pandemic taught us anything, there are going to be disruptions to the way that we learn and work. You know, there's going to be another something 10 years from now. It might be something, you know, tech-based. It might be, you know, I hope not, but it might be another global pandemic. But I think the idea that our work, the way that we have done it, is constant, it isn't. And I just think that's a reality that we need to anticipate and accept. So what does it mean for us to tinker and trial different ways of learning? When I was at United World College, something I really appreciated was we didn't do traditional teacher evaluations. Everyone was set up with a mentor, and it was about mentorship. It was about conversation. And, you know, I've had that conversation with other folks about, you don't have to do the traditional, you know, someone coming in and doing an observation, which is often not really authentic and not necessarily a great use of anybody's time. You can do that differently. And what is at the heart of the goal that you want to do with teacher evaluations? You can do that through mentorship. If you want teachers to be supported and to grow, you know, I kind of think that idea of helping teachers build up their support networks, that's a much better way of doing that than, hey, someone's going to come and observe you 3 times a year. But I know for a lot of people, it's, you know, the obstacle of, but that's the way we've always done it.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing that, you know, we have to get people to stop saying that's the way we always have done it, because your point is so true. While this pandemic is going on, Tracy, my wife, was in California. It was 54 degrees in the Mojave Desert, you know? Yeah. There were forest fires everywhere. I went biking along the Mosel. Half the hotels were closed because they had been flooded. So if you think normal is going to continue, I think we need to be very just candid with each other. And that idea of being adaptable and flexible and nimble, I think, is so important. And Tricia, thank you for bringing that up, because I think whatever you want to call normal, that day's gone. However difficult it is to digest, and I know there's a grieving process, etc., but I think your point is so true. I'm just wondering, you know, here we are coming to the end of the podcast. What, you know, if you look at teachers and think of teachers down the road, you know, you're giving so many encouraging words. You're really the positivity and this idea of empathy and the deliberation for time and this idea of professional learning community. Any thoughts for school leaders and teachers, you know, as they move forward, just something that you feel that has really helped you in your own journey that you think maybe they can consider and deliberate?
I think a couple things from a school leader standpoint that we saw come out of this pandemic that I think is really interesting to take forward. We really hit hard, you know, when we were virtual, which again, a lot of the support we were doing through that was here in the States, where in my state, in Washington, we were shut down for quite a while. Like we're still got places that are pretty shut down. One of the things we saw from a leader was the idea of the power of video and the power of seeing your face inside of a message. And so even as simple as, use any one of the free tools that allows you to create a video and just send a link to a video in an email. And we had principals and school leaders that started doing that. And the feedback from teachers was like, oh, it was great to see your face. You can be funny because it's in an email to your staff. You can be funny, you're lighthearted, you're drinking your cup of coffee. They see you're as tired as they are. And it's not an email with a list of things to do. And I mean, that is such a little switch. Like, we all know how to make videos now, whether it's Screencastify or Loom or pick your iPhone, it doesn't matter. But there's this little switch of, like, I think before the pandemic, we took for granted seeing people. And I think there's little things like that I hope that school leaders continue to do on the school leader end. It's just like, instead of writing that email on Friday, make a video that's highlighting this week's accomplishments, where they can go back and they can listen to it, watch it again. And it doesn't need to be long, but it's different. And it gives you that person's face, which is so much different, and so much, context gets lost in email sometimes. You can't have that expression of excitement. You just read excited with 3 exclamation points isn't the same as seeing somebody get really excited on screen.
Absolutely. I love that idea.
Yeah, I think that from a school leader standpoint, I think that's just one of those little tips that we've seen school leaders do, and I'm seeing school leaders continue to do that.
Yes, it's funny. There are quite a few directors that have moved and they've done the video instead of the long letter. Yeah. And especially during the pandemic, some leaders were like, every Monday, hey, I'm with my coffee. I'm unshaven, or the goatee was really big.
Exactly.
The gray hair suddenly showed up everywhere. There were just a lot of lovely little honest moments. I think I think what you're, really that amplifies with your suggestion. Tricia, maybe just kind of on the educator, a teacher thing that you think would, that you've seen that really, that little shift that maybe people can explore and consider.
There's a great book that came out called Street Data by Shane Saphir and Jamila Duggan, and they talk about, many schools now talk about the idea of we're data driven, and this book gets into the idea that lived experiences are also data, and how important it is that we make and take time to listen to each other's stories. And I think school leaders can help facilitate teachers having that time and space. But I think that idea of teachers really being able to have time to share their experiences with one another is so incredibly valuable. And maybe that is done in part through video. Maybe that's done in part through, shared collaborative spaces. And maybe it's also done in person with mentorship. Last year, Jeff and I had a webinar that was all about, sharing our story of the past year. We have a webinar coming up in a few days that's also about finding your metaphor for the moment. And I think, storytelling is like a technology tool as well that builds community. So making that time and space for it, and also realizing, when I say good leadership is good storytelling, that can be really scary for people because maybe we don't all see ourselves as storytellers.
Yeah.
But we have 2 different free PDFs on shifting schools: the Finding Your Metaphor for the Moment and telling the story of your learning journey. And they kind of take you through that process. So I think just making a little bit of time to dig back into that toolkit of resources that helps us communicate our stories is really valuable, teacher to teacher and also teacher to student. I think when things are scary, which they are right now, they are scary for parents and caretakers, for learners of all ages. So taking that time to really tighten up our communication can be, I think, incredibly supportive and is just really necessary.
I love the story.
Yeah,
Go
the
ahead,
last
Jeff, please.
thing I'll say, John, before you do it, is like on what Tricia was saying. I think one of the small shifts you can make is when we meet as a team. So Tricia and Chrissy Hellier, the third person in our small team right now, we meet every week, but we don't call it a meeting. We call it a huddle. And the first literally half hour of the huddle, we don't accomplish in air quotes anything. We listen to each other, and it starts with like, Tricia's in Canada and I'm here in the States. And so it's listening to each other. We're all involved in each other's lives. Like, I mean, Tricia and I have not physically been in the same place since 2016. And I can't wait to someday give this woman an amazing hug. Like, we've both gone through losses this last year. And we're in it. And so we don't call them meetings, we call them huddles. And a good 30 minutes of it is us just catching up. And it's only been a week. It's like we see each other every week. Yeah. But then the other 30 minutes is really good time. When we get into the work, it's in the work. And nobody's tied to their idea. We throw stuff out. We're trying to figure out what's the next thing. How do we support educators the best we can? But even a little switch, like not calling it a meeting, calling it a huddle, just gives us a different priority on what it is we want to do. So just another quick little thing.
Love the huddle and the story. Both of you, thank you so much. I know it's really early for you, and I so appreciate you taking the time. I'm about to go and have my sundowners, but you're about to have your breakfast. So I so appreciate, and really to the audience, shiftingschools.com, there is some unbelievable, amazing stuff there. Do spend some time. And of course, the podcast, definitely a must subscribe to. And so thank you. And we'll definitely connect again, maybe at the end of the year, and see how your journey and your story and how many more huddles you've had together, and hopefully a hug somewhere, a real hug. But thank you both. It's been a real privilege and honor to have you both today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John.
As always.